Number 10. Unfaithful. Viking warriors were large, strong, tough, and rough men who drank like fish and partied like it was 1999. And remember, I do. I wouldn't go as far as to call the coastal raiders gentlemen, since, well, they were not gentlemen. It's fair to say that they weren't exactly so nice to their women. For example, it wasn't that uncommon for a Viking male to take a bed with his wife. It was also not uncommon for a Viking man to take a bed with someone other than his wife, which, unless you're a collection of certain people from Utah, that's not okay. Not that I'm here to judge anyone from Utah or the Vikings, but I believe if you fall in love, you gotta stay within those boundaries of that marriage. It's just traditionally a two-person party, not 4 or 5. Number 9. Revenge. Signy was a sweet lass who unfortunately married King Sigurd, a rather nasty and brutal king. He would earn his malicious title when he had Signy's family unalived, except for her and her twin brother. But wait, there's more. Signy then plotted revenge with her sibling by meeting up with a sorcerer who changed her appearance. She then went back to her brother where they engaged in 3 nights of awkwardness and shame only a family watching in Force Ghost form could witness. She then changed forms again to give birth to her son that would assist in her revenge. Eventually they overthrew the Mad King and set him on fire for his misdeeds, where she then also willingly walked into the fire because she felt like she was no longer fit to live. That is one wild story. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, I guess. Number 8. Love Triangle. There once was a maiden so fair and so beautiful, apparently the most beautiful and smart. Sounds like a winner to me. Gudrun was her name, and she was stuck in an unfortunate love triangle. Kjartan and Bolli were friends and foster cousins. Kjartan immediately fell for the beautiful Gudrun. His father, however, did not exactly approve of this fling, as he felt she was kinda sus due to her previous marital adventures. So while holding Kjartan back, Bolli went to swoon the beautiful lass. This worked. However, shortly after being distracted by a trip, Kjartan finds out that his love is now in an entanglement with his best friend Bolli. This leads to a confrontation where Kjartan is struck with one blow by Bolli that claims his life. Bolli instantly filled with regret, the same way Anakin felt when confronting Palpatine and Mace Windu, and a what have I done sort of moment. It was awkward, but their story was a little bit easier to understand. I don't know, bad dialogue. Number 7. Volund the Smith. Volund the Smith was in love with a Valkyrie, which honestly is just really cool. Come on, I mean, who gets to be in love with a Valkyrie? And after a brief marriage, the Valkyrie had to go back to what they do best, which is to pick up soldiers who have perished in battle. As Volund was going full Marvin's room over the grief of his loss, he was kidnapped by a king who imprisoned him to marry his daughter. The king was so serious that he had Volund's hamstrings cut, so he could not escape his captivity. So to get back at the king, he slayed his 2 sons and fashioned a goblet with jewels made from their eyes. Knocked up the king's daughter and blew that popsicle stand. Sure, it wasn't his wife yet exactly, but she was gonna be if he hadn't have turned her brothers into everyone's least favorite set of dinnerware. Take note of this one, folks. Don't do this one at home. Number 6. Leif Erikson Day. Yes, the very same from SpongeBob SquarePants. Leif Erikson, the first European to land in North America. Hundreds of years before everyone's new least favorite explorer Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. A Viking man leads an expedition that honestly must have been just the worst. Sea travel just wasn't great back then. This really was a huge moment in history, one for the ages. But imagine breaking the news to his wife. Listen honey, I know you've been hard at work cleaning and cooking and taking care of our children, and we both know I've been a great husband with all my drinking and fighting and all the mistresses I may or may not keep. So I just want you to know that I'm going to sail across the ocean for months and build a settlement in a completely different corner of the earth. Okay, bye. See you later. Yeah, I'll write you.
Number 5. Tarring and feathering. Okay, we've all heard about this one. It's brutal, of course, but the most shocking part is how many steps this one involves. You know what I mean? Like, you'd think at the feather part, one guy would be plucking, like, what are we doing? This is insane. I have to go home. It's been hours here. This is horrible. This one goes as far back as 832 AD. This disgusting act has been going down for quite a while. Again, it's so many steps. This is horrible. Who invented this? A man stealing on trade journeys was to be tarred and feathered. This was for stealing during journeys. Again, this is what I'm saying about steps here. First, you'd have to shave this Viking's head, which I don't know if you've seen a Viking recently, but that's gonna take a minute. A lot of hair, sure. Then said Viking was covered in tar and then duck feathers chucked on top. Then, as if it couldn't get much worse, this poor guy covered in feathers and tar was forced to run between 2 lines of the men that he lived with and stole from. Now at that point, these other guys would throw stones, bricks, anything painful, you name it. Now anybody caught not throwing an object at the feathery fellow was liable to be fined. So I know it sucks, but grab something and grab it quick. If the thief did make it through this line alive, again, after being tarred and feathered, then he was off the hook from there on out. Then he was, I guess, innocent? I don't know. That's horrible. I wouldn't make that, no way. Number 4, trial by ordeal. Quite the ordeal indeed. Look, I mentioned ordeal by fire earlier, and that's quite a hot mess. But trial by ordeal is, I have no words. Humans are so stupid, honestly. Introduced after Christianity, wild. Trial by ordeal was used as a test to determine whether someone was innocent or guilty. And yeah, spoiler alert, it was in fact not foolproof at all. In fact, it made absolutely zero sense at all. Basically, the accused would be placed into the center of everybody, and then they would have severe pain inflicted upon them in a multitude of ways. Like, they all just beat this person up. It was horrible, to say the least. If they survived all this pain, they were innocent, and if they didn't, then they were guilty. Who wrote the rule book on this? That doesn't make any sense. What kind of insanity is going on here? But wait, it gets even better. If their wounds were clean and without infection after 3 days, then they would be found innocent because it was a sign that the gods had intervened to show their innocence. So yeah, a lot of steps to be proven innocent. And healing apparently is one of them. Who knew? Number 3, no insults. Yeah, the YouTube comments section could take a note from this one. Here we go. No insults. Be nice. This one's pretty good. This would change the game today. If you hurled insults at somebody back in the Viking age, well, they were entitled to compensation. And they could summon everybody else who's around at the time to be a witness. Yeah, they could be like, hey, you hurt my feelings, give me $10. I guess that is happening today, but on a much larger scale. Comedians, really. If you spoke bad about somebody during the Viking age, even if the person wasn't there, it could ruin their reputation, right? And because of that, you need to pay them for the possible damages. Again, we see this happen today in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't even matter if the insult was true either. It's too late, right? You spoke it, now it's out there. You did it. Your reputation was how you gained employment, met friends. It was a really important thing back then, more important than now. Can't be messed with, especially if you're a Viking. Yeah, no way. Also, if you insulted one man, you insulted his entire family as well. You know, the whole Viking rule. There were some words, however, where a man would be allowed to kill you if you said them to him. So yeah, choose wisely, I guess, with your insults. Number 2, rap battles. Before we get to our big bad number 1 spot on today's list, we have to mention the best part of Viking tradition, in my humble opinion. Battles, but with words. Not with our fists, with our emotions. Fighting, or rap battles, or my favorite part of history, I would have killed it, honestly. I was writing some before lunch and I think I'm okay. During those days, you needed ways to pass time, right? If you couldn't play hockey and there weren't any villages to destroy, what does a Viking do? Why, you have loud poetry, that's what you do. Fighting comes from the Old Norse flyta, meaning provocation. It's basically insult exchange, but make it theater. Now it's just ASAP Rocky. Norse literature really has tales of their gods fighting. Imagine that. Imagine how cool that would be. Imagine the next season of Loki and he's battling Freya in some sort of rap circle, some cipher. That'd be amazing. The whole purpose here was not to see who could diss the other's hometown the hardest, but rather this was a challenge in order to see who can spontaneously think of a poetic retort. It's all brains and no brawn. A little different than traditional Viking battles, right? In Anglo-Saxon England, fighting would go down during a great feast. Imagine that, you'd enjoy a roast while watching a roast in real life. Double the roast, double the fun. Later, this was of course entertainment in the 15th and 16th centuries in Scotland. But don't get it twisted, Viking fighting got pretty intense. And finally, number 1, the blood eagle. The best/worst for last. Here we go. This was a ritual method of execution that was detailed in late skaldic poetry. Again, if you're eating food right now, maybe give it a break for a minute. I don't know, giving you a heads up. In the 2 instances where this horrible punishment was mentioned, the victims, historically, who both happened to be members of the royal family, they were both in the prone position, right? So they would lie flat on their tummies, then they would have their ribs severed from their spine using a sharp tool, then they had their lungs pulled out through the opening to create this sort of like, wings, I guess. Just like a nice lungy pair of wings. We love a creative Viking, I guess. Now, both instances where this insane punishment is said to have went down, historically, both of them were accused of killing their own fathers. So I don't know what was going on back then or who's doing what, but we've got some daddy issues that are not being handled well at all. So don't do that, I guess. Don't do any part of that at any time. Again, how many steps goes into lunging somebody? I can barely carve a pumpkin in one go. You know what I mean? My wrist gets tired. I can't do that. It's a lot of work.
At number 10, cutting fingernails. Each civilization had their own specific beliefs, religions, and rites. For the Vikings, their belief in Norse mythology impacted a lot of their daily lives and even their burial rituals. One specific prophecy from their religion depicted the end of the world, and as anyone would, they tried to avoid that at all costs. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok was their version of the end of the world, and during this event it was foretold that a lot of stuff was gonna happen, like giants and demons approaching and attacking the gods, and a ship called Nagfar would carry a fleet of giants. This ship was said to be made of the fingernails and toenails of the dead, and the bigger the ship, the more giants would come. Out of fear of this happening, the Vikings took every precaution to prevent Ragnarok and subsequently the arrival of this fingernail ship. To do this, the Vikings built into their burial rites a very important step, cutting the fingernails of the dead. The Vikings had to remove the fingernails of the dead so that they couldn't be used to build the giant ship, but other than their removal, no one really knows what they did with said fingernails. The Vikings were also said to have kept their own fingernails clean as to prevent the same outcome. At number 9, teeth filing. Many civilizations had body modifications as part of their culture through time. Mesoamerican civilizations were known to shape their skulls and alter their eyes, women in China altered the shapes of their feet for many years, and so many cultures around the world adorned themselves with tattoos, piercings, and scarifications. In Viking culture, their body modifications often included dental work. Evidence suggests that some Vikings filed horizontal lines into their teeth, and some of them filled those grooves with red dye to make themselves look even more terrifying. Because the Vikings were known to be voyagers traveling the seas to new lands, some anthropologists believe that the Vikings may have picked up their idea for dental modification after making contact with people in West Africa, as many tribes over there were known to file their teeth into different shapes. Would you guys ever do something like this, or would you rather leave that up to the Vikings? Now, before I continue telling you guys about the weird and crazy things that the Vikings did, let me first ask you guys to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and maybe also consider subscribing to the channel to see more awesome videos like this one. At number 8, carbon monoxide. The Vikings were pretty good builders, mainly of ships. Their ships were huge, intricate, and very impressive, but where they excelled in shipbuilding, they lacked in the construction of their homes and community buildings. Apparently, the longhouses that they built for their communities were actually pretty unsafe to be in and trapped a lot of toxic gases inside of them. Researchers from a university in Denmark recreated one of the Vikings' longhouses and lit a fire in the center of it, like the Vikings would have done back in the day. After simulating an average living environment and monitoring the atmosphere inside of the longhouse, they realized that there wasn't enough ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide from building up inside. This would have led to a lot of people getting sick, especially those who spent long periods of time inside. The Vikings didn't know that though, but they also had their own remedies for curing sickness, so I don't think that they would have thought much of it. At number 7, onion soup. Speaking of Viking home remedies though, they had some pretty interesting ones. Every civilization had their own takes on medicine and healing their sick and injured, and the Vikings were no doubt the same. For them though, soup was their tool for healing, and for x-rays. Sort of. These days we eat soup when we're sick to warm up our bodies and balance out our sodium levels, and doctors have actually proven that eating chicken soup actually does make you feel better when you have a cold, but Vikings didn't really have the same idea. For them, onion soup was their thing, and they used it to diagnose people. Viking healers would make up a pot of really strong onion soup and feed it to a warrior who had a wound around their abdomen. Once the person drank the soup, the healer would see if they could smell the soup through the wound. If he could, then the wound was fatal and there was no sense in trying to save the person, so they would just move on to the next warrior. It saved the healer time trying to attend to everyone, but it kinda sucked for the person who got left behind, because not only are they not going to make it, but their last meal was that awful onion soup. At number 6, Blood Eagle. We all know that the Vikings were a ruthless group of people, but their methods of execution really painted a clear picture of how terrifying these guys were, and how they had a colorful imagination when it came to imagining new ways to unalive somebody. The Vikings came up with a method of execution called the Blood Eagle, and yes, it is just as terrifying as you would expect with a name like that. The Blood Eagle basically involved cutting someone up to make it look like an eagle. They would cut apart the rib cage and then spread it apart to make it look like wings, and then after that, while this person was still alive mind you, they would pour a salt solution over the wound, pull out the lungs, and arrange them over the rib cage to, again, make it look like wings so that this person could flutter away into the afterlife. Now, the mysterious part of all this is that historians aren't exactly sure if this was actually a real method of execution or if it was just embellished in Viking records to make them sound cooler. I, for one, hope that it wasn't actually real because that sounds brutal, but when it comes to Vikings, you never really know.
Number 5.
How to ward off Draugr. Draugr, for those who didn't play Skyrim, are a Viking denomination of the undead. It's presumed as a certainty that when a person is buried in the ground, they will rise from the dead as a Draugr. From there, they'll attack people, and everyone will generally have a bad time until the Draugr is killed via decapitation, dismemberment, or any act of making it just not move anymore. To prevent this from happening in the first place, Viking land burials were done extremely carefully. Straw would be placed under the body and scissors would be laid on the chest, while their toes were sewn together and nails were pushed through their feet. They would then deconstruct a portion of the house and take the corpse out through it, reconstructing it later, as Draugr were believed to follow the path back from their place of burial. They would then be entombed, and all of the items they'd owned that remained in their house would be turned upside down until their grave was magically sealed. Number 4. Berserkers. A denomination of shamans, berserkers were warriors trained to fight and channel various spirits into their body. There were 3 schools of berserker: the wolf, boar, and bear, each one serving a slightly different role. To train, these berserkers were sent out into the wilderness to become more in tune with nature, and also drive themselves insane in the process. This would supposedly imbue them with the strengths of their respective school of combat, and so when they were called upon to enter into Norse conflicts, they were supposedly given the ability to transform into their respective animal, ripping the opposing warriors to shreds. This account is shared both by Vikings and the victims of Vikings, though it is more than likely that this is just an exaggeration meant to imply the bestial behavior of a berserker when in a trance. Number 3. The Blood Eagle. This one is not for the faint of heart. A ritualistic form of execution, the Blood Eagle is an extremely violent method of dispatching enemies, which is described in the sagas. For a long period of time, these were thought to have been fictional, but as recent bodies have been unearthed that appear to have been victims of the Blood Eagle, there seems to be more truth to this than initially thought. The Blood Eagle involves the victim being laid on their front and a knife being used to separate their ribs from their spine. The spine is then removed and their lungs are spread out in the form of crimson wings, creating the eponymous Blood Eagle. Number 2. The Bloat. The Bloat was set as a ritual that would occur once every season at 4 set intervals in a year, but another could be organized if circumstances required it. The most well-recorded bloat was one performed by Sigurd Håkonsson, detailed by Snorri Sturluson in the saga of Hakon the Good. This ritual involved a massive amount of human and animal sacrifices, as well as sacrifices of weaponry. Blood was also collected and splattered on the walls, altars, and participants. A feast would then be had and toasts would be made, first to the gods and then to the fallen. Number 1. Viking chief cremation ceremonies. We've all heard of Viking cremations, how they load their dead bro onto the ship and sail it out into the ocean, sending a flaming arrow into it so that they might be buried at sea. However, if it was a chief that died, things would get a little bit more screwed up and nasty. First off, one of the chief's girls would then volunteer or be volunteered to join the chief in the afterlife. She would then be made to get mad drunk and then would be made to sleep with every single man in the village. Seriously. She would then be strangled, stabbed, and loaded onto the boat and the whole fire thing would go down. What can I say except what?
Number 10. Tar and feather. This is something my mom always said to me when I was being too loud, boisterous, or distracting her from a task at hand. I'm sorry, Mom, it's just what I do. Mind you, looking back, perhaps it wasn't my fault. Perhaps letting a hyper child eat chicken McNuggets and soda after watching a bunch of 007 movies was not the right choice, Mother. I used to be a big 007 fan. After running all over my house, my mom would say, "Son, if you don't settle down, I'm going to tar and feather you." Well, in the times of Vikings, this was a legit punishment and for legit criminals. The crook's head would be shaven and covered in tar, which which even that alone sounds horrible. And then a poof, I guess you describe it, of duck feathers was thrown onto his stickiness. He then would have to run through a gauntlet, and everyone would be tossing stones and bricks because, well, I guess tar and feathers weren't enough. If you made it out alive, then no further punishment was required. Number 9. Fines. Surprisingly enough, one of the most common punishments of the Viking era was fines. Nothing deters criminals like owing the governing body some cold hard cash. Except a lot of criminals don't really have any money, hence why they would steal in the first place, so owing money isn't exactly a great deterrent in my opinion. However, fines varied on the severity of the crime and who the person was or what the person was, and the law of the land really. Viking civilizations didn't exactly have a written law and would differ from different lands. All I know is that in Skyrim, which is loosely based on that of Scandinavian folklore and Norse mythology, that when I get fined for committing a crime that I only did because I pushed the wrong button, I promise it was an accident, I immediately pay the fine and pickpocket it back. It's not so bad. You pay a fine, you get away. It's not so bad. Number 8. Banishment. Hey, look over there, it's Skorgamor, said Ulfric, or someone of another Norse-like name like that. Don't worry, Norse sounds confusing to me too. What's not confusing, however, and very straightforward but still pretty harsh, is banishment. If someone was found guilty enough of a crime, they could be banished from the village, and in time of wild beast disease and, well, other Vikings eyeing your village the same way flies look at cow manure, it was dangerous to be alone for that extended period of time. So some people were forbidden to come back into town and don the name Skorgamor. We'll go with that. Good luck in the winter, that's all I have to say. That's a tough life. Number 7. Outlawed. This one is kind of interesting. So oftentimes when choosing the punishment for a criminal, it came down to fines, banishment, and outlawing, and a lot of times all three. Outlawing went hand in hand with banishment. In a nutshell, it means you are no longer protected upon the laws of the land. So should someone maybe want a little revenge, there's not much you can do. Should have committed that crime there, cowboy. Like I said before, this was oftentimes done to those who were banished, so not only were they tossed out of the village, but also not protected by the village anymore. Pretty much leaving the criminal to nature and whatever she has to offer. And we all know Mother Nature, she can be a little rough sometimes. Whew. Number 6. Rodeo. If you're gonna be dumb, you gotta be tough. This world is rough, if a man's gotta make it, he's gotta be tough. Wise words from a trailer park supervisor. Huh? This one is just crazy, stupid, and violent, so strap in folks. There was a trial, or a way of passage, if you want to call it that involved Grease, a cow, and a criminal. You take the angriest cow in your herd and you grease its tail up like a fat dude whose thighs have been chafing all day at a water park. The crook's hands would also be greased up. The cow was given a not too PETA friendly poke from a farm tool, and the idea was while the cow was rightfully mad, kicking, stomping, and mooing, the crook would have to hang on for as long as possible. If he did and didn't let go, then there was no charges. If he did fall off and slip and let go, then, well, so long von Schlurgenbergen, Foreman or Ulfric. That's a Swedish name or something, I think. I don't know.
Number 5. Drunk sword fighting and other things. Imagine letting a 2-year-old hold a very sharp broadsword. Sounds like a bad idea, right? Well, nobody seemed to think so when they put swords in the hands of drunk Vikings, which, let's be honest, that's pretty much what a 2-year-old is essentially like a drunk person walking around. Outdoors, Vikings constantly wanted to one-up each other on the strength meter. They had weightlifting competitions, who could lift the heaviest stones, they wrestled, held archery contests, and of course sword fighting competitions, as well as all the games Bree mentioned above. Were they sober? Probably not. They also had a game called Togo Honk, which was kind of like tug of war. Men would sit on the ground facing one another, press their feet together, and bend their knees. The goal was to try to straighten your opponent's legs and flip him over. Honestly, that sounds like a blast. Do you think it's a smart idea to put a sword in a drunk guy's hand? No, but it was the Viking era. There were literally no rules except for a few.
At number 4, not enough chairs. Now we know that these Viking celebrations would often last for days on end, right? So imagine if during all that time you couldn't sit anywhere comfortable. Sounds pretty unfortunate, but it was the reality of a lot of Viking parties. Because these gatherings were so big, hundreds of people would be in attendance, but unfortunately there wouldn't be enough space to sit. To try and accommodate their hundreds of guests, Vikings would break out their longest tables and benches, but usually this still wasn't enough space for everyone, so it became kind of a rule that only the most important people were allowed to sit. Chairs are thought to have been pretty rare, so the most powerful and wealthiest Vikings were allowed to sit in chairs. Everyone else had to fend for themselves, either sitting on uncomfortable benches or just standing around. Now, doing this for a couple of hours? No problem. For a 2-week celebration, you can count me the heck out. If my tushy's not comfortable, I'm going home.
Number 3, fertility celebrations. So we talked a lot about what Vikings actually did back then and how they partied. They partied pretty hard. But now we're talking about what kind of festivals they had. This holiday is celebrated on April 30th in Finland, Sweden, and Germany, but goes all the way back to the Vikings. This night is called Walpurgis Night, or Valburgas Night, or I probably said it wrong, but let me know, and is named after a woman called Valborg. She was born in 710 somewhere in Dorset/Wessex as the niece of St. Boniface. She traveled with her brothers to Württemberg, Germany and became a nun. She lived in a convent of Heidenheim and became renowned for her healing powers and was canonized as a saint after she died. This celebration is in honor of her, however it was originally a pagan celebration called Beltane, a celebration of the return of summer. Viking fertility celebrations took place in and around April 30th, and due to Valborg claiming this date as well, the two celebrations became one and the same eventually. Viking fertility celebrations usually involved sacrificing an animal or two of some kind, and included all of the above.
At number 2, Harvest/Winter Night Celebration. Next up in celebrations to mark on your calendar, we have the Harvest/Winter Night that took place on October 31st. It can also be referred to as Elf Blessing, Disblessing, or Frey Blessing. Kind of like our spooky tradition today, it was a time of honoring the ancestral spirits, spirits of the land, the Vanir, along with the powers of fruitfulness, wisdom, and, of course, death. A little brutal, yet kind of merciful in a way, the animals who weren't going to be able to make it through the winter were smoked or made into sausage. It was often led by the women of the household. They left the last sheep in the field as an offering to Odin, though this varies. It also marks the start of something called the Wild Hunt. The roads and fields became territory of ghosts and trolls and marks the beginning of the darkest and coldest time of the year. The festivities and feasts are particularly joyous, and they mainly aim to celebrate kinship, accomplishments, and the tales of the year.
Last but not least, Yule! This last one is perfect for the season we are entering and a great way to end the list. The festival of Yule was, kind of still is, a celebration of 12 days. It was the most important of all Norse holidays and began on the night of December 20th. The god Yngvi Freyr rides over the earth on the back of his shining boar, bringing light and love back into the world. Later, Christianity influenced things, changing the god to Baldur, then Jesus, who's said to be reborn at the festival. For the Vikings, Yule signified the beginning and end of all things, taking place at the darkest time of the year. Children were said to leave their boots outside filled with hay and sugar for the god's journey, and in return they would receive a little present. Sound familiar? On top of that, the celebration would include drinking, feasting, songs, games, banquets, and sacrifices to the gods and the ancestor spirits for the 12 days. They even had what was called a Yule tree, which inspired the use of the Christmas tree today.
And we're kicking off this list with blot. These were blood sacrifices that were performed in order to appease the gods. Luckily, blot often refers to sacrifices of animals rather than human beings. It was often horses or pigs that were used, but the size of the animal was in direct correlation with the level of gratitude they were showing towards the gods. The animals were placed over stone altars before being sacrificed, and their blood was collected in a bowl that would get passed around, and with each person they would, take a sip of the bowl. Sometimes twigs were even dipped into the bowls of blood and then shaken around at onlookers, spraying them with droplets of blood, kind of like a Jackson Pollock painting is what I picture. The meat of the animal was also doused in its own blood before being feasted on. This was a fairly common practice. It would take place all throughout the year, but now let's move on to a more special Viking tradition. Next up, we have Viking Yule. The Viking Yule festival sounds pretty pleasant. Some of our modern Christmas traditions were inspired by Yule. They'd feast, burn the Yule log, there was a Yule tree, again very Christmas reminiscent. They drank heavily, sounds like Christmas to me. There was one tradition though that's thankfully been left out of our modern holiday celebrations: human sacrifice. Yes, every 9th year, during Yule, there would be a total of 81 human sacrifices spanning over 9 days. So that's 9 human sacrifices a day. Yes, kings would sacrifice 9 men per day, with their heads being offered to the gods. What a way to bring in the holiday season. Happy Yule, Sven. By the way, cancel all your plans because the king just told me you're getting your head cut off this afternoon. This isn't even, really all that strange. Human sacrifice has been present all throughout human history, all over the world, really. And it's just kind of funny thinking about how celebratory it was here. Not something that's easy for us modern people to wrap our heads around. The various methods Vikings would use to ward off the Draugr. First off, what is a Draugr? They're basically undead warriors. Zombie Vikings. Yeah, zombies. Scary enough as it is. Imagine facing off against an undead Viking. They were depicted having superhuman strength, they smelt of death, and had a ghastly appearance. They would also often be, depicted as blue or like dark, with decay. If you've ever seen the Northmen, you may be familiar with the Draugr. We get this awesome fight with one of them. Very cool creatures in Viking folklore. So Vikings, being as superstitious as they were, sought to prevent the recently deceased from becoming one of these undead entities, and there were several methods they would employ. They would sometimes place a pair of scissors on the chest of the corpse. They'd hide twigs in their clothing, or they would drive needles into the bottom of their feet to keep the dead from walking around again. That one makes sense. That's a pretty practical one. They would abandon children deemed sickly or weak. This isn't much of a surprise given that Viking culture was so heavily centered on strength. Vikings were a warrior culture, constantly engaged in battle, so children that were too small or sick were just really of no use. The most common method of ridding themselves of the weak was to just chuck them into the sea or take them deep into the forest where they'd be left to fend for themselves, often freezing to death or becoming a wolf pack's next meal. They didn't just do this in order to maintain a strong society though. Vikings also lived in a very harsh climate where, those that were unable to contribute were just really extra mouths to feed. They were a bit of a burden. So yeah, different times. This is also a practice not unique to Vikings though. Another famous group of warriors, the Spartans, dispose of unhealthy children. So yeah, I'm glad we live in 2023. Vikings actually dyed their hair. Yes, as it turns out, that classic image a lot of us have of Vikings in our minds is having long blonde hair and beards. It's not just a myth. I guess, nobody ever thought the blonde hair thing was a myth necessarily. Many Nordic people have blonde hair, of course, but that super extra blonde look really was a thing. The beauty standards in Viking culture called for blonde hair. So for those that didn't have it naturally or just wanted to get it extra blonde, they would have, they would actually use a specific type of soap that was heavily concentrated and contained high amounts of lye, which we still use today to make stuff like glass cleaner and fertilizer, actually. This would basically strip their hair of its natural color. They were basically kind of like bleaching their hair, really. They'd also do the same things to their beards, which, oh my god, I can only imagine how dried out that would have made them. Beards, you gotta moisturize these things, the hair is very different. I bleached my hair before and it gets super stiff. It's almost like hay at first, so they must have had some extra crispy beards.